To this episode of Live Without Training Wheels. And we're here tonight to talk about shame, which might seem like a little bit of an unusual thing to talk about, or maybe not. Maybe this is something that you've looked forward to discussing. I am looking forward to talking with you about it. Shame is a huge topic, and talking about shame in general would be like saying, I'm going to give a 30-minute talk on parenting or a 30-minute talk on homeschooling. It's just really too vast of a topic to touch on in one evening. So what I really want to hone in on this evening is there a place for shame in parenting? And specifically, I'm thinking about the idea, that sometimes our children don't seem to be ashamed of what they do. And what is our job in that situation? So let me do a few housekeeping details here for you so that you will be comfortable as you watch, and then we will dive right into that topic. I just want to say at the outset that if you are watching from YouTube or Facebook, you are more than welcome to continue watching from YouTube or Facebook. I'm broadcasting live from a platform called Crowdcast and streaming that broadcast to YouTube and Facebook so that followers there can see it live or in the replay. However, the questions that I'm answering and the poll that I'm going to refer to in a minute are actually inside the Crowdcast platform. If you want to join us in Crowdcast, you're more than welcome to. You just have to look in the video description for the link and click on over and click the little green button that says something like save my spot or something like that to join the Crowdcast event. Let's see. At the bottom of the screen, if you're in Crowdcast, there is a poll. I'm very curious to know your thoughts on the idea of saying shame on you. Is there ever an appropriate time to say that to your children? Yes, no, it depends, or I'm not sure. Your answers are anonymous, by the way, so you can feel free to put in your thoughts, and we'll just have a group consensus of what the answers are. Not it won't show up by your particular name. And then also, if you notice in the Crowdcast event, right next to the polls box, there's a button that says ask a question. So if at any time during the discussion you have a question, you can pop your question in there. And when we get to the end of the video, I will answer the question. Sometimes I have a chance to get to all of the questions. Sometimes, depending on the topic and the number of questions, we run out of time. So what you'll want to do is keep an eye on the questions as they come in. And if you see one that's of particular interest to you, click on vote to upvote it so that way when I start answering questions, I can begin with the ones that are of the most interest to the most people. Okay, let's see. Oh, and that also reminds me, speaking of the ask a question box, if you're watching this on the replay, you have a couple of options that those watching it live don't have, which is that you can watch me at high speed if you want to kind of skim the content. There's a little gear icon in the bottom right-hand corner of the video that you can click on. And then also you can click on the ask a question box and click on the green button next to any of the questions that look interesting to you to jump right to the place in the video where we discuss those questions. So that's kind of a neat replay feature that I'm glad for you to be able to take advantage of. So let's start talking a little bit about shame. As I mentioned before, shame is a huge topic. And if it's something that you personally have wrestled with, then you already know that. If it's not something that you personally have thought about or wrestled with or interacted with, then, it might seem like a kind of a simple topic to address. Maybe you just need a dictionary definition and a few tips. But I want to warn you about something. Shame is everywhere. It is everywhere. It is behind many feelings and emotions and reactions. It is in places where you would not expect to find it. And so, although you've come here tonight to talk about and think about shame in the context of parenting, and, maybe you're thinking we're going to talk about our children's shame, which we are, but I just need to warn you that when you begin to think about shame and to read about shame and to consider it as an issue in your home, you will begin to see where it may creep up or be present or be causing pain and hurt in your own life. And it can be somewhat of a rabbit trail, and I encourage you to follow up on that rabbit trail a little bit. If you're watching this from my blog post. I've listed in the blog post in the show notes 3 books that I have read with regard to this topic that I find helpful. I'm going to talk more about them, but I would encourage you to follow up with those. If if something kind of catches your attention and you're thinking, oh, well, I didn't really think of shame as a part of that, or as shame as being something that could be behind that. I want to read more about that. There's no possible way I could cover it all tonight. But as I talk about these 3 books, you can get an idea of how they each address the topic, and then look into any of those if they seem like they would be helpful to you. So as I said, this is a huge topic. There's no way that we could cover it all. So what I want to do at the outset is I want to set a couple of very wide boundary posts, if you will, just to define our very outermost boundaries, and then to move inwards just a little. We're not going to get to, the center of the topic where we've worked out all the details and we have it all covered. But we're just going to start with a very wide boundary and move in a little bit. And this is especially in terms of a biblical view of shame, or in other words, the Bible's perspective on shame. Okay. And here are the 2 very outermost boundary points. The Bible talks about shamelessness as a bad thing. In other words, the complete inability to feel any shame about anything that we've done. That's viewed as a negative thing. Okay. And then on the complete opposite extreme, the Bible talks about being without shame as a good thing. So think about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They were naked and they were not ashamed, and that was a good thing. So if our very outermost boundary points are that it's not good to be completely incapable of feeling any shame, but yet it's very, very good to not have shame. Those are kind of our very, very wide boundary markers. So now let's move in just a little bit and begin to talk about what is shame exactly. And, again, whole books have been written on this topic. 3 alone, just in my reading and thinking and preparing for this talk. And so there's no way that I could completely define shame. As a matter of fact, in these books, even the chapters where they're attempting to define shame, they spend pages and pages on the definition of shame, because it's not enough to just lay out some words. They do a lot of giving of examples. And so, it's not something that I'm going to nail down for you tonight, but I'm going to provide us a bit of a definition because it's going to be helpful to us as we move forward. So the first book that I want to mention to you this evening is called Shame Interrupted. It's by Ed Welch. He is a counselor, and he actually is a counselor and a professor who teaches other counselors to be counselors. And so this book is written from a biblical perspective, and the format of this book is that he is unfolding the story of the gospel, specifically as it relates to the battle against our shame and the struggle that we have with shame. And he says, this is his definition. What is shame? Shame is the deep sense that you are unacceptable because of something you did, something done to you, or something associated with you. You feel exposed and humiliated. Or, to strengthen the language, you are disgraced because you acted less than human, you were treated as if you were less than human, or you were associated with something less than human, and there were witnesses. Now, what I really appreciate about Ed Welch's book is that he addresses the shame that we wrestle with that is not related to things that we have done. We tend to think of shame as, you do something bad and you feel ashamed, or you have shame because of your behavior or something. But we can experience and wrestle with and do battle with shame that has to do with our associations. For example, another book that I read was by famous shame researcher Brene Brown, and her book is called oh man, I'm missing it. Hold on. Give me just a second. I thought it was just me, but it isn't. Something like that. Let me see if I've got my... No, I don't have it here. Okay. Anyway, I thought it was me, but it isn't, or I thought it was just me, but it isn't. Something like that. I'm sure you've seen it. It's a very popular title. But in her book, she describes scenarios such as a young woman whose mother committed suicide and the shame that she dealt with by, being associated with that, and people's reactions to her and to her father as, relatives of this woman who committed suicide. So I appreciate that both Brene Brown and Ed Welch wrestle with the shame that isn't even related to things that we have ourselves personally done. So Brene says, shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. So that flawedness can be related to, again, something we've actually done, and it also can be related to something someone has done to us or something that's happened, in a group that we're associated with. Gussie says there were witnesses. That's what gets me. Yes, absolutely. That language is really powerful. Now, I think the language that really got me started on this journey was hearing Brene say in her book that this is actually what got her started on her shame research. She was, I believe, a counselor in a group home for struggling youth, and the supervising, I believe, psychologist or counselor there spoke to the social workers, of whom she was one at the time, and said this: you cannot shame or belittle people into changing their behaviors. You cannot shame or belittle people into changing their behaviors. And she said that her reaction was, a little bit of incredulity, like, really? I'm not sure that's right. Wait a minute, maybe that is right. And she, just in wrestling with that, got herself started on a completely new career trajectory of studying shame. And that quote also was something that really jumped out at me. And I think part of the reason why it jumped out at me was because it really resonated with something I was already wrestling with in my own mind and in my own parenting and my experience of watching my children struggle with things and considering my own choices and behaviors about how to go about things. Something that really struck a chord with me is, we all know the famous passage from the book of James that talks about being slow to speak, slow to anger, quick to listen. But then we don't often follow through and read the next verse that says, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And I read a post about that, talking about, one of the reasons that we yell at our kids is because it works. And I know, before you block me on Facebook, what I mean when I say it works is that in the temporary short term, it can actually have the results that we're hoping for it to have. So for example, if I am frustrated because we're in a hurry to get somewhere and my children are not getting moving and finding their shoes and doing all the things they need to do, and I start yelling at them, they usually will start moving faster, and they usually will quickly find their shoes, and that thing that I wanted accomplished will be accomplished. But at what cost have I accomplished that, right? Am I really securing for my children godly attitudes and true righteous behavior by that yelling? And so I think, in a sense, when God is saying, that the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God, he's making a similar statement that, Brene heard in her experience and that she went on to study. You cannot shame or belittle people into changing your behavior. We recoil from that statement because we've seen people's behavior change based on shame, right? We've seen people who were shamed into making a change. Maybe we were one of those people, right? But the thing is that behavior changes that come from shame or someone else's anger are often superficial and short-term and short-lived, right? I listened to something recently that had a huge impact on my thinking about my own changes, and that helped me. Sometimes when we can see something from our own perspective, it really helps us to sort of translate that into what it might feel like from our children's perspective. But I was listening to a podcast about losing weight. And, this is something that I've struggled with, I don't know, forever. Like, I don't know, most adult women, I think, have always had a sense that they need to lose some weight and they should eat better and should exercise more. But the thing that just blew me away was that the woman on this podcast was saying that we so often face the weight loss struggle and the decision to, say, diet or exercise from a position of shame and self-punishment. Now, I would never say that I'm the type of person who feels she needs to punish herself. I would not have identified myself in that way. However, when she went on to explain that further, I thought, I think I actually do this. She said, for example, we say to ourselves, you've been bad. You are fat because you've been eating, you've been bad about your eating and you've been bad about your exercise, and you deserve to be punished. And your punishment is that you should have to eat things that taste bad, and you should not get to eat things that taste good. And you should have to do really unpleasant things to yourself, like, exercise and go on walks and lift weights and do these painful, unpleasant things. That's what you deserve because of how bad you've been. And she said that if we're ever really going to have long-term success in taking care of our bodies, not just, being skinny and fitting into smaller clothes, but like really taking care of our bodies, that's only going to come from a place of saying, I want to take good care of myself. And therefore, I am going to nurture myself with this healthy and good food that is going to care for and nurture my body, which I love. And I am going to take the time in my schedule to do good things for myself, like, stretching my legs and exercising and getting fresh air. Now, I'm not saying that I heard that one comment on a podcast and all of a sudden I'm revolutionized and I no longer have that struggle. And I think of it purely from a perspective of, nurturing myself with good, healthy things. But the concept of how we often approach that struggle and why it's often difficult really resonated with me. I already knew that I don't do well with losing weight by making myself squeeze into clothes that are too small and going around feeling just disgusting all day long. That does not help me to make healthy choices. That helps me to feel like desperate and depressed and to want chocolate. So I do already know about myself that I need to go ahead and, it's so tempting to be like, these clothes are too tight and I don't feel comfortable and they don't fit, but that's what's going to motivate me to lose weight. And I hate to spend the money to buy bigger clothes. But sometimes being comfortable where you are is what's necessary to have the strength to step forward and make those changes. So all that to say, all of these things that I recognize in myself and all of these ways that I think about things that are either helpful or unhelpful had an impact on how I thought about shame when it comes to our children and their struggles. And one of the things that was really kind of eye-opening and mind-blowing to me, and I've talked about this before a lot about in terms of insecurity and things like that, is that oftentimes we look at our children and we assume that what we're seeing is a lack of shame or a lack of guilt or a lack of feeling, bad about what they did or whatever. And it's often, very often in my experience, quite the opposite. In other words, what we're often seeing that looks like a kind of a hardness of heart and they don't care and they just did something cruel and they're kind of laughing it off. And we're troubled by not only what they did, but even more troubled by watching them seemingly not care about it. And so we had this real temptation to want to kind of poke a needle in. And it's not entirely a nasty desire that we have. Perhaps we're seeing another child who's just completely crushed and discouraged by cruel things that were said to them or by a precious, item of their property that was destroyed. And we're just we're hurt for the hurting child, and we're confused and bewildered at the lack of empathy from our other child. And we think, I think I need to somehow provoke them into feeling shame. And we have good intentions, but the problem is that very often what's actually happening is that the child who seems to be, cruel or hard-hearted or not feeling shame or not caring, it's actually exactly the opposite. As a matter of fact, they feel very embarrassed, very ashamed of what they did, and they don't have a good way of handling that. They don't have a good method for processing that, or they don't have the experience and the maturity to remind themselves that confessing and asking for forgiveness can be the opportunity for, healing and peace. And so they are handling that overwhelming sense of shame in all kinds of ways. And it looks very different in all of our children. So let me give you a little example about something that happened this week that I noticed that helped me to remember how differently my children react to moments of shame or embarrassment. So, for example, when we were in church on Sunday, in our church, when it's time for the Lord's Supper, for communion, our elders go from row to row with a plate, and they pass the plate of bread or the plate of little wine cups down, up and down the rows. And so you take it from your neighbor and you pass it to the person beside you. Well, my 10-year-old, who is a very tender-hearted child, happened to be looking in the other direction when the plate came her way, and she didn't realize that it was time for her to pass the plate. And so, a number of people were kind of not rudely, not angrily, but just staring in her direction, kind of waiting for the next thing to happen. And both her father and I kind of had to say, psst, to get her attention and point out to her that she needed to pass the plate. And when she finally realized what was going on and realized the number of people that were kind of staring at her, waiting for something to happen, she turned completely red. And once the plate had passed on by her and she wasn't the center of attention anymore, she burst into tears. And so, this was her way of processing those intense feelings that she was seeing. And because she tends to process her feelings, her strong feelings, with crying, it evokes pity from me, right? And so I feel so bad. She didn't do anything wrong. Nobody was upset with her. It was just intensely embarrassing. And so she was crying. And, so my natural reaction was to scoop her up and to want to comfort her and to want to reassure her, it's okay. Nobody's upset with you. You don't need to feel embarrassed. And she, was able to be comforted. But not all of my children react to their strong feelings that way. So some of my children, when they are feeling intensely embarrassed and ashamed, react by I have one who grins. And that's exactly what Gussie just says. My oldest smiles when she does something wrong. And it's just kind of this nervous laughter, embarrassment, awkward grinning. But it can be very frustrating as a mother, especially when you're trying to say, you did this thing and it's very serious. And why are you grinning? Your sister's crying. Why would you think this is funny? But I've learned this is the way he reacts. And when I, began kind of layering on the what is wrong with you? Why aren't you feeling ashamed? He grins more. And I have another child who handles these big emotions, oftentimes with anger. So it can be the smallest thing pointed out to her, and it might not even be a character issue. It could just be as small as oh, this math problem isn't correct. And she often responds with anger. Okay, but all three of these children, a child who reacts by crying, a child who reacts by smiling, a child who reacts with anger, they all three are experiencing big emotions that they don't necessarily have the maturity and the tools with which to process, these big emotions that they're feeling. And they all need the same thing. They all need mommy's, protection and guidance. They all need to be reassured that there is an answer. There is a way forward. Now, I wrote a post recently that's similar to this idea in talking about teaching our children to apologize backwards. Because a lot of times our children are resistant to apologizing due to the fact that they really don't understand how it's supposed to end up. And so, in the post I said it's kind of like to our children, it feels like we're saying, turn out your pockets, give up all of your dignity and self-respect, let go of any hope of ever, being treated as a valuable human being again. But that's not what an apology is about. An apology is about, the end goal of wanting peace and wanting restoration of fellowship in the relationship, wanting unity. We're asking our children not to apologize because, they need to grovel as the punishment for the thing that they did. We're asking our children to apologize because we want for them that healing and that peace and that restoration of joy in the relationship. And, the apology is the way to move towards that healing. And so oftentimes, in order to help our children move towards that, we have to explain, look, this is what the whole process looks like. And this is what is available for you that I'm encouraging you to move towards. It's not just you did a bad thing. Now you have to do this thing called apology, which is sort of like an emotional, running of the gauntlet where everyone can just sort of emotionally spit on you and hit you as you run by because, that's what you deserve for your misdeeds. It's a process towards healing. And so oftentimes when our children don't understand how to process their shame, they don't understand the forgiveness that's available, or maybe like many of us, like myself, we know it in our heads. We know intellectually, I can confess and be forgiven. I don't have to sit with this guilt or this shame. But yet in the moment, it's still hard to remember that. It's still hard to behave accordingly when we're struggling with fear and doubt and shame and all of those difficulties. And so often, the thing that our children most need is what we should be doing in our homes all the time anyway, perpetual reminder of the gospel. And I'm not saying that we don't need to point out what was wrong, that we don't need to offer instruction, that we don't need to offer consequences. But so often when we see what looks like hard-heartedness, when we see what looks like a calloused attitude, it really is not because of a lack of shame. It really, in fact, is because of an intense feeling of shame that our children are afraid. It's like, I'm not even going to open the lid because if I open the lid and I let it out, there will be no healing. There will be no recourse. I don't know what to do with it once it's out of the box. And so the only safety that I have is to keep it in the box. And that manifests itself as, an embarrassed smirk or reacting in anger, all of those things. And so when we feel like, we need to inject some more shame into the circumstances, we're actually intensifying the problem. We're making it worse. And I want to talk about one particular thing that I myself have done, and you probably have too, because it's just such a common occurrence, but it really, really struck me as I was reading about shame and thinking about shame. And this is the one book that I have not yet read. That I read that I have not yet mentioned to you this evening. And it's by a fellow named Curt Thompson. It's called The Soul of Shame. Now, this book was recommended to me by my mother, who is a licensed Christian counselor. And the thing that she likes about this book is that it is written with regard to a biblical view, but also the biological brain chemistry, brain wiring things that are happening as we experience shame. And so it's not just a theological treaty, but it's talking about the neurobiology, essentially, of shame. And one of the things that really struck me is that guilt is actually a feeling that we don't experience until maybe about age 5 or 6, because guilt is a feeling of feeling sad about how our behavior has affected someone else. And so in order to feel sadness about how your behavior has impacted someone else, you need to have the biological ability to experience empathy. You have to be able to imagine how your behavior is affecting someone, and then, to experience that pain as if you yourself were or in that person's place. That's empathy, right? And so in order to be able to experience that feeling of guilt, you have to, it's a developmental feature that children don't have when they're very little. However, shame is something that we can experience from very early on. Shame, that feeling of not just, I did something wrong, but there is something wrong with me. There have been studies done where a parent will do something like they might just look at a child with a very blank expression. And then the child will make a noise or do something, and the parent will turn and smile at them. And then in another part of the study, they will have the parent, instead of turning to smile at the child, the parent will remain blank expression or looking away and not respond when the child makes a noise. And the children quickly become agitated. And I'm talking little children, like, an 18-month-old, because it is hardwired into us to desire to know that we are loved and accepted. And even so young as an 18-month-old can accept, that facial expression from the parents as approval, as love, as being wanted and welcomed. And so we can experience that shame very early on, far before we could even articulate or explain what we're feeling, or even be able to, even in our minds, put into words why we feel that way, or why we feel that we are, shameful or are ashamed about it. And one specific thing that Curt Thompson talks about that really got my attention is called the shearing effect of shame. And let me see if I can find the, I thought that I copied down here the quote. Okay, he says, when shame strikes, however, the interchange is wholly different. It often occurs when we are moving in a direction of creative exploration, minding our own business, when an unexpected force of nature enters and brutally throws us off course. Now, I wish I could, read you the whole chapter because it's fascinating, but I just want you to have in your mind that that brutal force of nature. And he's talking about not like a parent, but in your brain, what's happening. So one of the most damaging things we can do to our children, in which, again, I have done this, I have recognized in my own behavior patterns, ways in which this has happened. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But the most damaging shaming experiences are those that happen when we are completely not expecting it, not in a situation where we're already feeling some shame and some guilt. So, I talked a moment ago about how sometimes our children feel or seem to be calloused and hard-hearted, and we feel like, we need to shame them a little bit. And, I don't think that that's usually helpful. I think it's usually counterproductive. But in those situations, they are already feeling a measure of shame. And so it's not as startling to them emotionally and even, neurobiologically, as this example is that Dr. Thompson talks about shame shearing. And so let me describe what that has looked like in my home so that you'll get an idea of what that might be like in your home. So here's a very typical scenario. The children are off playing somewhere. So, they're just playing happily with some toys. They're getting along. In their mind, there is no reason to feel guilty or ashamed about their behavior. They are happily engaged in creative play or creative invention of something. And I go, say, into the bathroom, and I discover that someone has left, a bunch of shoes and socks, on the floor, or everybody who came in from playing dumped their coats, or somebody went in the bathroom and squirted out all the toothpaste in the sink because they were playing, make a magical potion in the sink or something like that, right? Some scenario where I discover something that is right now not on their minds at all. And I go into the room where they are, and I begin, you know, in to some level, ripping into them, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to mean that I'm even yelling or being extremely nasty, but it's in terms of their state of mind and their experience of their emotions, it's a very out of the blue scenario. So they are, from their own perspective, being very well behaved and good and innocent. And I, kind of burst in on that with why are all the coats on the floor? I thought that I told you to put them away when you came in. It's a very emotionally and neurobiologically startling occurrence. And if we are in the habit of doing that, if we are in the habit of regularly kind of startling them with shame and scolding and disapproval, and I'm disappointed and displeased with you, when they are in the course of just happy, cheerful playing and obedience, that is really damaging to our children. And it has the effect often, and again, I'm telling you what I've seen in my own children, of them kind of walking around with this constant sense of guilt. Like, I don't know what I did wrong. I can't think of anything that I did wrong, but I just have this feeling that at any moment I could be getting in trouble for something. I don't really know what it is. I can't think of anything, but there have been so many times where in my mind, I hadn't done anything wrong. And then all of a sudden I found myself being scolded completely unexpectedly. Now, I know you might be saying, well, it wasn't unexpected. They know they're supposed to put their coats away, or it wasn't unexpected. They know that they don't, play with the toothpaste in the bathroom, right? But I'm not talking about like whether overall they should have known that that was a good or bad thing to do. I'm talking about in the moment, the way that their brains were working, the way that their minds were, experiencing life. That was a startling experience for them to, seemingly suddenly be in trouble, to find that you are displeased with them when they had no expectation of that. It's very different than, I just broke something. I'm feeling really guilty. Mommy walks in the room. Mommy has to hand out a consequence. That's still not a pleasant experience, but it's not the shame shearing that Dr. Thompson was talking about. And so I'll just give you, in parting, one thought. And this is what I tell myself, especially in those moments where, you go in some other room, you discover something that somebody's done, and you're going to need to go and correct them. Maybe they're already in the bed, maybe they're off playing, but you're going to need to go and kind of break into their consciousness with a little bit of a correction. So this is what, to keep me from making poor choices and doing damage that I will regret later, this is what I say to myself: instruction, not destruction. Instruction, not destruction. This is like I'm repeating this to myself in my brain, right? Because do they need to pick up their shoes from the bathroom floor? Or do they need to clean up the toothpaste that they, left a mess in the sink or whatever? Yes, they do, right? But I'm going with the purpose of instruction, not tearing them down, not making them feel a little bit of pain for the pain that they've caused me, but for the purpose of instruction. And I know that it's tempting to say in your mind, because I have said this in my mind, they don't deserve any more instruction. I've told them 50 million times that they should do this. They don't need to be instructed. They already know this. But it's not instruction in terms of like, oh, they didn't know that they should put away their coats, and so now I have to go tell them that they should put away their coats. What I mean is that as I'm going to my children, my whole goal is to instruct them in right behavior. Not necessarily that they didn't know this, but that they need to be reminded again. And I'm not saying that there might not be a need for a consequence or some, kind of follow through on, whatever it is in your home are the consequences for not following directions or whatever, but that I'm going to my children with the attitude of, I want for their good for them to be instructed in this. This is not about me getting back at them for my feelings being hurt. This is not about me emotionally manipulating them by, by inducing feelings of shame and guilt for what they've done or how they've displeased me. This is simply a matter of instruction. Instruction, not destruction. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, oh, yes, once I understood that, I never did that again. As a matter of fact, I think, the Lord has a sense of humor, and he likes to enable us to fall, to remind us that we are not beyond the need of his grace and his help ever. But I was talking with my husband about these very things a couple of weeks ago. Just, I don't think it's ever our place to shame our children. I think, the Holy Spirit can shame our children in a loving way, like to point out to them ways in which they need to change. But I think our job is to continually remind them of the free grace of the cross and to continually be pointing them back to that. They're already experiencing shame. We're to remind them of the remedy. And even after having this, I'm having these wise theological musings on proper parenting, it wasn't maybe 24 to 48 hours later before I was essentially shaming my son for what he'd done, which and I felt like he didn't care. He wasn't responding properly. And my husband just gently came over and said, I'll take it from here, and kind of let me go. And later I said, I'm so embarrassed. That's exactly what I was saying I didn't want to do. And he's like, I know. And that's why I knew that, it probably wasn't your best moment, because you were doing the very things that we talked about. And I just wanted to provide you with an opportunity for escape. And I was thankful and humbled and encouraged to see that he refrained from doing to me what I was doing to my son, right? He could have come in the room and said, honey, why are you behaving that way? That is so awful. You're being so rude to him. And instead, he was gentle and gracious and instructive to me when I was in destruction mode with my son. So that was a wonderful, beautiful example to me about how much more loving and effective that behavior is, the instruction mode rather than destruction. So, okay, in just a moment, I am going to answer your questions. If you've got more than are in there, go ahead and enter them. And if you've got a thought about the poll, you can go ahead and answer it. I'm gonna make one comment. There's not really a right answer to the poll, but this is what I was thinking, that when we say shame on you, I think, I'm wondering if that's not a cultural phrase, like a thing that we've been in the habit of saying. And I wondered some about what's behind that. Like, are we really saying, I wish shame on you? Or are we saying, is that just a way of saying that behavior was not appropriate? Or sometimes I think it's even said kind of sarcastically and jokingly. So I suppose the real answer to that question is that we'd have to spend some time considering the intent behind what we're saying and the effect that those words are going to have on the particular person to whom we say them. Okay, let's look at our questions. Lisa says, I'm definitely guilty of startling my kids with shame or laying huge guilt trips on them out of my own frustration. Do you have ideas about how to move forwards towards changing those hurtful patterns? Okay, I didn't see exactly, Lisa, when you asked this question. So it might have been before I mentioned this, but my helpful thought to myself is the instruction, not destruction, which again, I'm not saying that cures me, but, reminding myself of that, practicing that regularly. And then of course, repenting, which I think is something we should be doing regularly with our children. Have you ever seen one of those logic puzzles? We used to do these in school when I was a kid. It'll give you a collection of shapes and it'll say like, these are all nurbles. And then it has another collection of shapes and it says, none of these are nurbles. And then it has a bottom collection of shapes and it says, which of these are nurbles? And so you're supposed to look at what are the characteristics of the first group. And so what could you tell about what a nurble might be? And then what are things in the second group that would prove the characteristics you chose from the first group, because none of these have those characteristics. And then, you look through the third group and pick them out, right? And so When we apologize to our children, what we're saying is, I confused the logical pattern here by introducing, things in the group of nurbles that actually are not nurbles. In other words, in my communicating to you what I think of you, and in my communicating to you what the Lord, how the Lord sees you, I've introduced false data points. And so repentance, apologizing on a human level, is saying, could you please remove that data point as a representation of how I think of you? Or could you please remove that data point as a representation of how bad this behavior was? And I have had to so many times say that to my children, because often what happens is they have done something that's not appropriate, like, they left their coats on the floor, or they didn't quickly get into the car when I called them to get ready. So there was some level of something that they did wrong, but my reaction to what they did was far more related to my own frustration, or my own, I'm afraid about being late, and I'm afraid of what everyone's going to think of me if I'm late, or, whatever other things I'm dealing with. And so I had to go back and explain to my children, this often happens, like I'll apologize and I'll say, I'm really sorry that I got angry. And then one or more of them will say, but we deserve it because we really did something wrong. And that's the point at which I say, okay, yes, but the strength of my reaction to you was not in accord with the behavior that you did. You're right. You should have been, getting ready more quickly, or you should have gone to get your shoes when I asked you to. But, that was like 20% of the problem, and 80% of the problem was that mommy is frustrated, or I have a headache, or whatever it was. I should have calmly followed through on the consequence for your behavior instead of handling it with, an emotional attack on your behavior. So, just modeling proper ways to process emotions and proper ways to handle other people's sins against us, and repenting when we don't, so that we can point out to our children, okay, please remove that behavior from your list of examples of proper ways to handle problems, or proper ways to handle other people's sin against you. If that makes sense, I hope that helps. Okay, I don't see any questions. I'm going to wait for just a minute more in case there are some. Thank you to those of you who have joined me live this evening. It's always more fun to have live viewers and interaction. Thank you, Natalie and Gussie and Lisa and Rachel. Thank you for joining me this evening. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and log off, but as you know, this is on Facebook. So if you have more questions, then you can go leave comments on the Facebook post, and we can interact there even after the live video is over. Hope you all have a wonderful evening, and I will catch you next week. Oh, I did want to mention, so the February shows are all up. If you're interested in seeing what's coming up in February, just click on, hover over there where it says Lynna at Live Without Training Wheels, and click on my account, and you can go there and check out the shows that are coming up, which are in February. We've got, let's see, we're going to talk about, next week, we're going to talk about homeschooling as an introvert mom. Then we're going to discuss, the week after that, homeschooling high school with my friend Ann Carrico, who's written quite a bit about that. The week after that, I'm going to talk about homeschooling through depression. And then the fourth week in February, we have Julie Bogart of Brave Writer as a guest here talking about her new book, Brave Learner. So I'm really excited and looking forward to that. So, okay. Thank you all for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.